Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear experts, good afternoon and welcome to FIIA's event. This afternoon we are going to discuss Europe, ideas for Europe, economy and security, bringing Europeans together. We have a highest level of visitors from Paris. We have our own experts as well participating in the conversation ahead of us. Clearly, recently, Europe has pulled its act together when it comes to economic regulation, green energy, circular economy, energy regulation. There are segments that are clearly showing that European Union can lead and take responsibility and have global weight. Strategic capabilities are many, and this is very important, although from many capitals, these importances are seen from different perspectives. So it is vital to have a shared view on relevancy that European Union should have or must have. Although the glass is always half full, we have to be realistic and cool-headed as well. When we enter next year, when there's going to be a flurry of different activities concerning European economy, the rules, and also defense. Unfortunately, when you measure in purely economic metrics, European Union has been declining when it comes to its share of global economy. US is doing relatively well, and of course we can see the rise of China in these metrics. So there's clearly a reason to pull resources together in more refined way to find better common added value in different sectors. Also, when it comes to defense, Europe, after the end of the Cold War, there was a peace dividend. Defense expenditures went down. 2019, the average was 1.2 in terms of gross national product, 1.2%. So others have far surpassed that. US is still there, surpassing others. China has increased quite a lot. Next you have India, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Middle East countries, and then you have Germany, France, UK. So how to proceed in terms of different defense capabilities in different sectors, how to coordinate that within Europe, but also transatlantically, how to find room to maneuver what we call a strategic level autonomy. So there is going to be interesting panel discussions today, conversation, and judging from the lunch we had with our guests, it's going to be interesting and clarifying as well, insightful. The first panel will be chaired by our very own Juha Jokela, whom we trust when it comes to producing knowledge on the European Union quite a lot, the head of our European Union program, and he will introduce participants of the first panel. So, Juha Jokela, the floor is yours.
Excellencies, dear invited guest, dear Mika, thank you very much for this introduction and also framing of this debate that we are going to have here today. This is something what we in the EU program have looked forward quite eagerly. We've been following very closely the German elections. And now after the German elections, of course, we don't yet know what kind of government there will be in Germany. The eyes are on Paris. There is the EU Council Presidency, and then, of course, the presidential elections, and then the parliamentary elections in the coming spring term in France. So this I think, creates an interesting context to discuss big EU questions here in Helsinki as well. And we are very delighted to have visitors with us here today from France. This is a joint activity between the Robert Schuman Foundation and the FIIA. We have collaborated earlier also on a similar kind of tasks, and our cooperation has provided some fruitful thoughts for our research as well as the discussions on European matters. And I'm therefore pleased to introduce to you the first speaker of today, who is actually the chairman and the founder of the Robert Schuman Foundation, Jean-Dominique Giuliani. His CV is very long and extensive, and there are several key positions very close to the political circles, both in Paris, but also in the European Union. He has, for instance, acted as a director of the cabinet of the president of the French Senate, René Moroni, and as well as a former special advisor to the European Commission. And I have personally seen him in many occasions in Europe and heard him intervening in debate and discussions in many capitals, including Brussels and Paris, of course. So we will start with your opening intervention, and then we will move forward in the program. Please, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Joannin. Mr. Director and dear friends, it's a pleasure to be there, and thank you for your warm welcome. We know FIIA for a long time. We know your excellence. We know your works and the work you are doing to explain the foreign policy, to understand the foreign policy, and to put forward the new challenges we faced as EU members. We at the Robert Schuman Foundation, with the name we bear, we also are French. And I can't hide that Robert Schuman, Jean Monnet were French people, and they were at the beginning of the EU. And our think tank is already proud to work with you at the FIIA to try to explore the new challenges we face in the EU. As you know, as you mentioned before, the first semester of the next year will be under the French presidency of the EU Council. And as you know, also, President Macron and all the French government is really involved in preparing and succeeding this European moment at this particular period with some deep changes in the economic field, the geopolitical area, and the geopolitical challenges in the world. And we are well placed, we French, to understand how much this is a changing world, because we had some trouble in the Indo-Pacific area some days ago. In fact, what we want to do is at the Robert Schuman Foundation is to listen to our partners and friends around Europe and to try to push some idea on the table of the French government in the perspective of the French presidency. This is the reason why we began this tour here in Helsinki with you and to try to exchange some new ideas about two main issues, economic recovery, and after that, after the recovery plan, what kind of rule do we have to put at Brussels and for our government? what kind of economic governance also. You mentioned before that we have a problem of growth and a problem of efficiency in our economic governance. This is the main issue. What kind of lesson do we have to draw from the sanitary crisis, and what can we expect of EU new policy, EU new governance at the EU level on economic field? We are facing the same challenges, the Green Deal, the climate change, but also the growth question and the geopolitical place we want to have between the new world giants in Asia, China for sure, but other countries too, and our traditional allies, the United States of America. This is the second issue we want to exchange with you on. We know that in November, at the EU Council, and after that, on the spring, we will adopt a new strategic compass. That means that we have to put together the vision we have for the future, but also the view that we share or not share on the common threat and risk that we are facing at the geopolitical level for our country. And for sure, for France, but also for the EU, we expect, as a European think tank, that we could put on the table some new policy on the foreign affairs and defense issue. As you know, France, for the time being, as the main army in the EU, France is engaged on different fields in Africa, but very involved in the Mediterranean area and also in the Middle East. But France is conscious right now that it could not act alone. And we have to share our view of the world and our vision of the future to try to better implement a new foreign policy that is lacking at the EU level. This is the reason why we are there, and we are very, very thankful to you to share this view with our free spirit and the work we did in the past. Because I am in Finland, a country which share very, very common reflex with France, the necessity of an independent vision of his own interest and defense policy on his own. I want to share my view as a European observer. We need also to better know what we are really, what is our contribution to the EU prosperity. Europe right now should not be the North against the South against the North. We have a very small continent at the global level, 4 million kilometers square, I believe. You are the neighbor of the greatest country, Russia, with 70 million kilometers square, I believe. So we are a very small continent, but a very prosperous one, the first commercial power in the world. And we need to implement right now a real geopolitical vision that's which is credible if we also have a defense policy. And this is quite new. It's not something easy to manage with some other country, but I know that with Finland is the easy way to discuss, and it is the best place to begin this discussion, and this is work. Thank you very much to give us this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Giuliani, for these words and opening topics as well introduced in your speech. And I'm assured that there will be a fruitful discussion on these big topics on economy on the one hand and security. I think building the bridge, as you suggested, between the two topics is something what brings us to the discussions of geopolitics as well as geoeconomics, which is one of the priority areas of the Finnish Institute currently in our research activities. But now we will move to our second speaker, also coming from Paris, and she is Pascale Joannin, who is the Manager Director of the Robert Schuman Foundation. And she also has held several important high-level positions in the higher national defense studies, for instance, and she has also written a great deal, big volumes on the European Union as well as other important topics related to the European politics. And we are very pleased to have you here with us today, and I believe this is at least your first visit to FIIA and potentially also to Helsinki. So welcome to UPI, and the floor is now yours, Pascale Joannin.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be the first time at UPI event. Eric and Mr. President were there for many years, so I'm glad to be here. It's always difficult to speak after the chairman because he has said everything, so I have just to put new little things on the table before the Finns take the floor and we have this exchange, because we are here not to talk, but mainly to listen to your view about the economy and security. It is the two of the three priority of the French presidency of EU Council next year. The last one is appartenance, so belonging, about values, rule of law, and etc. And of course, it is very important to speak about economy, because I do not think we share the same view, but maybe I'm wrong, and we have to discuss that. Because after the little crisis or many crises we faced the next 10 years ago, we have to adopt maybe some new regulation, common regulation, to strengthen the union. Because like Mr. Giuliani said, we are a trade and the first trade power because of the internal market, and it is very a very strong card in our play, global player. Trade is very important, competition too, but maybe we need to strengthen other things on the economic area, because it is mainly European Union is mainly an economic construction, steel and coal at the first, of course. Economic ECC and now European Union, but we lack some maybe tools in our pocket to strengthen the union, to play a global role as economic, face to the US, of course, and to China. And we are on the podium right now. If you look today at the economic, there is three main pole area, US, EU, and China. But how do we manage all together to stay on this podium in the next 20 years or 50 years? And we know that China has said publicly that in 2049, because it is a special date for them, they will be the first country in the world, powerful country. So do we accept that? Do we share things with China? It is an important country, of course, the most populate country, not the most large country. Your neighbor is the largest one. But it is important to see how we can stay ahead in the future, economically speaking. And of course, when we spoke about global player, we are, of course, a lot of tools in our pockets for economy, but maybe it is not the case for, and I see military Finnish. It's not the case for security. We have, of course, things on the tools and in the European Union, but it is mainly a competence that belongs to the national member states and not to the EU. It's a beginning of a new process inside the EU because we have this European fund, we have cooperation between armies on the grounds due to external theaters in Asia, in Africa, in Middle East, and we used to see the soldiers cooperate and to share things, but it is a little tools, and we have to think about more global security strategy. So it is good time because there is a discussion inside the EU because of the High Representative strategic compass. We have this European fund, quite new in the budget. We have also one key element, and is the reason why we are today, the French presidency of the EU. And of course, because France is a major actor in the security, international security, we can expect that France put on the table new things during the presidency, and we have to share with the Finnish and others what is behind this security strategy, autonomy strategy, strategic compass, and etc., etc. So we have to define clearly what we want to do to stay ahead. And maybe we have not used this word for the moment, but maybe I put it on the discussion. What our interest? And can we fight for the interest of the EU, who are not the US one, or the Chinese one, or the Turkish, or the Russian one? So do we have interest, and how we protect or strengthen it in order to be still a global actor in the next years? So I think the French presidency is an opportunity, a window to put on the table new steps. And you know, we are the Schuman Foundation, so the man who creates the first steps of the union. And if you don't remind this, the idea he has, it is not to go fastly, it is go to step by step, but surely to more integration, but step by step. So we don't have to invent a European defense from a day to day to the others, but to create steps, concrete action. And maybe it is a good occasion to talk with you about economy first, to strengthen the economy and the regulation of the future, and to build this new security agenda for the purpose of all the member states, not the French only, all the member states. And we share, even if we are not on the same geography and same history, a lot of things. So thank you for this discussion, and I enjoy to hear and listen our Finnish counterpart just to discuss after some elements. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pascale, Joannin, and it was a pleasure to hear you and also your insights both in the economy and defense. And I think there is plenty of new initiatives coming, partly from the French presidency, but also more broadly within the European system, as well as from potentially from Berlin when the government is there installed. So I think there is a lot of debate to be done during the winter time, and what will kind of what would be the national positions and the debates. It's of course very important and pertinent question for all of us. This is also why we have asked Dr. Päivi Puonti from the ETLA Economic Research. You work there as a researcher in macroeconomics and public finance research program to elucidate the kind of a northern thinking of economy, especially in the context of the changing fiscal policy rules discussion, as well as now the debate related to the joint debt issued by the EU, whether it's a kind of ad hoc one-off mechanism or whether that should be something that are potentially becoming more permanent feature of the EU. These are issues that have been highly debated in Finland during the past 1.5 years, and this is why we also thought that it would be good to have an expert in the panel who has written quite a deal on those, done also a very hardcore research on those, and Päivi has also previously worked in the Ministry of Finance of Finland, so I think there will be interesting insights to the discussion. Päivi, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Juha. I'm pleased to be here today to talk about the economy, the European economy in particular. So ladies and gentlemen, as we know, big issues are currently being discussed in the EU. As Juha mentioned, there's the review of the EU's fiscal rules as laid down in the Stability and Growth Pact, the issue of common EU debt, a European fiscal capacity, or even a euro area budget. I will briefly introduce you to the Finnish perspective on these issues. But first of all, let's be clear on the starting point. Our economies in the EU are intertwined. And this is true for the countries of the euro area in particular. We share the same currency and we share the same monetary policy, the stance of which depends on economic conditions in the euro area as a whole. This linkage between countries is recognized in the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which states in Article 121 that member states shall regard their economic policies as a matter of common concern and shall coordinate them within the Council. However, economic policy belongs to the competence of each individual member state. So to avoid any negative consequences of unsustainable fiscal policies for other countries, the treaty further states in Article 127, member states shall avoid excessive government deficits. And essentially this means that member states shall conduct prudent fiscal policies. And as I see it, these are also the basis of the Finnish position on all initiatives concerning economic policy in the EU that are currently being debated. And as an economist and as a researcher, I also find this position as internally consistent and can be justified on economic grounds. So first of all, the sustainability of public finances. In each member state, it is required not only for the interest and reasons of the single member state or for national reasons, but also for the smooth functioning of the euro area. Over-indebtedness in one country poses a risk to the financial and macroeconomic stability of the region as a whole. And therefore, we have the rules of the Stability and Growth Pact that aim to reduce the risk of over-indebtedness in member states. Currently, there is clearly room to simplify the rules without undermining their scope, and even without changing the treaty if member states so desire. Sustainable public finances ensure that a country has adequate fiscal space available to deal with future crises they will come, we know they will come. But even to simply boost the economy in a normal recession. But this requires that economic buffers are built in good times. So we economists say that you need to do counter-cyclical fiscal policy over the cycle. So not only boosting the economy in a downturn, but also creating buffers in an upturn. So as a result of all this, common fiscal stabilization functions or risk sharing among member states with the issuance of common debt are not needed as long as prudent fiscal policies are conducted in practice. Solidarity in times of crisis obviously is set apart, and for that we already have the European Stability Mechanism. But beyond that, the pricing of credit risk takes place in the financial market. And for extreme cases, we should have in place an orderly debt restructuring process to restore the sustainability of public finances if ever needed. As to the NGEU, Next Generation EU, that was set up during the pandemic, the Finnish Parliament approved the Recovery and Resilience Facility belonging to it as strictly one-off, and with the precondition that the Finnish government advances only proposals that strengthen member states' incentives to ensure sound public finances, and that also reduce the risks to financial and macroeconomic stability in Europe. And related to this, or to any novel financial instrument, in general, the government budget is the main instrument for allocating public resources in any country. So similarly, it can be argued that in the EU budget, the multi-annual financial framework should remain the main instrument through which EU funding is channeled. So to summarize, the main concern, be it in relation to permanent risk-sharing arrangements or less stringent fiscal rules or any new institutional arrangements, is how they affect countries' incentives to pursue sound fiscal policies. And in this sense, how they affect countries' incentives to regard economic policies as a matter of common concern.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Päivi Puonti, for your very clear presentation of some of the issues that are really debated here in Finland, and also framing the position, often the position that the Finnish Parliament and also the government has taken during the various years after the Eurozone crisis as well. And I think the interesting question here to discuss today is whether there is some room for maneuver, also in terms of the shifting balance of power in the economic field in global affairs, and Europe's position, also in light of the investments that are seen to be required for the green transition, as well as Europe's competitiveness in the field of digital and technological advances. So I think this is all something that is very much discussed in several EU capitals, and I think it would be interesting to hear how this feeds also to the discussions here in Helsinki. And our final speaker comes from our own institute, and he is Dr. Niklas Hellvig, who's been with us for several years. And Niklas is a leading researcher at FIIA, and he's been recently been leading a project which has focused on EU's strategic autonomy. And this project is, of course, a very particular one, I think, in terms of its scope, because it has not only focused on defense, security, or foreign policy, but also tried to incorporate issues related to the economic field and the key issues in the global agenda. So in light of this project and also his expertise in EU's foreign security and defense policies, as well as in Finnish positions, I will now like to invite Niklas to give your opening introduction. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Juha, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak here. It's great to have our French friends with us today and discuss also the upcoming French presidency, which will be interesting. And the first point I want to make is that in light of this upcoming French presidency, I think we have to remember that the nature of EU policymaking has changed in the last decades. I'm wearing a tie actually, which is the which is the tie from the French presidency from the year 2000. I was still in high school at this time, but it belonged to my father-in-law. But I was, when I saw this tie, I was thinking about how much it has changed actually since then. And back then, EU policymaking was a little bit easier. You know, there was the Franco-German motor still at the framing the EU debate. There was this kind of model that you have on the one hand of the political spectrum, Germany with some policy ideas. On the other hand, you have France with the different ideas. And when those two countries can agree, then usually all the other member states can sign up, and you have a good consensus, right? But this isn't as easy anymore. A lot has happened in between. Obviously, the enlargement has happened, and other issues. So what we see nowadays is also situations where we have Germany and France at the core deciding something, and other member states, whether it's Central and Eastern European member states, and sometimes also Nordic member states, looking at the core in Europe and wondering what has just happened. And I think one of those moments was this next generation EU budget when this was, or when the French-German initiative came last year. I think it took many in the Nordic countries by surprise. So I think, you know, there has been also a structural change in international relations that made the international environment much more challenging for the EU, and which kind of forced Berlin and Paris to push on some of these issues and be more proactive, which means for the Nordic countries up here that we have to watch the developments in Paris and in Berlin much more closely and see really where the development is going and what future surprises might look like. And in that sense, it's really nice to have you also here today as visitors to also give us your French perspectives of what's coming at us with the French presidency. So as you have already mentioned, I'm working on defense and security issues as well here at the Institute. And I think Mr. Giuliani was very right when he highlighted that Finland is really one of the proponents of closer EU defense cooperation. And it was highlighted also during the lunch already that one of the main reasons, or one of the reasons that Finland joined in the 90s was actually the security perspective, was to have this extra shelter for Finland in a more uncertain environment after the Cold War. And that is certainly still true today, that this is an important area. It's one of the policy fields that's also very popular, where there's still like a positive attitude towards deeper integration. And I think Finland will watch closely and look forward to these discussions on the European strategic compass that France, together with Germany, initiated during the German presidency a year ago, and that will end now during the French presidency, and what will be the outcomes of that. But while Finland is, as said, a proponent of a deeper EU defense integration, we should not forget that it also has very close bilateral ties with the United States and with other countries in other formats outside of the EU. So actually, during this difficult period of the Trump presidency in the US, what we saw was that Finland, together with Sweden, deepened its bilateral ties on defense issues with the United States, its bilateral cooperation. And in his speech a week ago, the president of Finland at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs birthday party, 60th birthday, he mentioned that Finland has a web of defense and security partnerships that it relies on. So it's not only the EU, but it's also cooperation with the US. It's a cooperation with the Nordic countries. It's cooperation with France in the European Intervention Initiative. It's cooperation with the UK in the Joint Expeditionary Force. And it has a quite pragmatic outlook, looking at where does this deepen our interoperability with partners, and where does it help also Finnish interests. So in terms of having an ambitious EU defense policy, I think yes, Finland would be my interpretation is in favor of that. But what we have seen also during the Finnish EU presidency, it should not come at the cost of bilateral partnerships, and especially at cost of the bilateral partnership also with the United States. So there's these two sides to the Finnish mindset on the defense debate. One last point I want to make, but we can dive deeper into that in the discussion, is what Juha already mentioned, is this interconnection between security and the economy. And I think this is really the topic that is going to be decisive in the future, also in the EU discussions. And Juha already mentioned that the FIIA also has a focus on this geo-economic development. So we see much more coercive actions by other states with economic instruments. We see that the economic competition, the technological competition in the world is getting much more fiercer. So we have to think about security issues not just as purely defense issues, but we have to think about what can we actually contribute with our economic instruments. And that is obviously where the European Union has much more competences when it comes to the EU. And here I think it's an interesting dynamic between Finland and France maybe, because France has a very active outlook when it thinks about economic issues. It's very strong in thinking about industrial policy. The fiscal dimension of the EU was mentioned, and how all of these instruments can help the EU to be a stronger global actor. And Finland comes at this topic more from a different perspective, and underlines preparedness when it comes to international trade and supply chains. It underlines the security of supply. Maybe has a little bit less of a state interventionist focus, but more focuses on close partnerships between the public side and the companies. But I think, you know, there's an opportunity for discussion. Where do French and Finnish views on the economy and using the economic instruments in this global competition, where do those actually overlap? And with these words, I look forward to the discussion today.
Thank you also for Niklas Helvig for your opening introductions, several important topics, and also a wonderful tie for the occasion. I would now ask our panelists to take a seat here in the podium, and then it's time to start our panel discussion. Please. I would also like to remind our viewers that there is a possibility to pose comments and questions through the chat function of our YouTube channel. That probably requires that you are logged into the YouTube, but that should be easy to do. So I will collect any comments and questions also through the digital channels from the viewers of this webcast. And then I'm happy to now announce that we have a small audience here today, because Helsinki and Finland has been lifting restrictions, and this is, I think, one of the first opportunities for us in FIIA for a long time to have an in-house audience here. So I welcome you also to the debate and also pose comments and questions. But let's start with the topics and themes raised in the opening interventions. And I would potentially first like to pick on the economy, because this is something that we've been discussing, and where there are divergence of views. I think we know quite well of those views, and they were also reinstilled in the discussion. But the kind of the debate in Europe that what we are now following, and also after the German elections, it seems to take sort of a new spin. And the spin is, so the new spin in this discussion seems to relate also to the German elections and the kind of the position that the German government might take. And also the views that we have heard from several economic experts. Including sort of here in Finland, that the corona crisis and the economic drop was managed better than during the euro crisis. Now the discussion is about investments. It's about the big projects related to the Green Deal of the EU, as well as the digital investment needs, but also infrastructure. And there's been also a discussion for quite some time, especially in Paris and Berlin, about these so-called big European companies called European champions, which relates to the industrial policy and also competition policy of the union. So in light of these debates and discussions and also perhaps new openings, I would like to ask especially Jean-Dominique and perhaps Päivi, that what is your take on this, this discussion, whether this is really a kind of a shift of views in comparison to the post-Eurozone crisis Europe, and now when we're talking about the post-COVID-19 Europe, and how far potentially this debate might actually go in terms of establishing joint mechanisms, policies, as well as resources potentially at the EU level to address economic issues. Jean-Dominique.
Yes, what I know that is that including before the sanitary crisis, we were lacking growth. And as it was mentioned before, our mechanism, our governance, economic governance, was not at its best. And the rule of the governance, the monetary policy, avoid a very big stake of growth in comparison with other continents, United States, including Asia, and something like that. So the fiscal compact, the fiscal rules, and maybe the constraint on the monetary policy has to be changed and to be adapted to the new challenges. And you mentioned the Green Deal, the fight against the climate change, but also the infrastructure need of investment or in digital economy. For example, in Germany, they are lacking, they are late in the digital economy and the infrastructure investment, and they need a huge amount of money. And this investment is not a German one, it's an internal market interest. This is the same in many countries around Europe. And in my speech, I mentioned the opposition between the South and the North. It's totally unfair. Italy has a surplus in its budget for 10 years right now. They have another problem about a question of transmission of the money to impulse an economic growth. This is true, so we have to be very inventive to invent something to answer this question. We have a question with the monetary policy, I believe. The monetary review of the ECB has shown that this is beginning with the target, the mobile target of inflation, of 2% of inflation, less strict than before the crisis. And what I can see from our German counterpart, from Chancellor Merkel, is that in acting with France and the EU Commission to put in place next generation EU, our German friends recognized they were not very good facing the Greek crisis. And they push EU to make some mistake in the name of the rules. So I am in favor of the rules. I am not in favor of debt, but I am in favor of investment for the future to, like Pascale said before, to stay ahead with the EU economy. So we have to invent new rule, maybe allowing difference between investment and functioning spending, for sure. Maybe with a global picture of the internal market and not a national one. It is the same in France. When the parliament has to vote for the EU budget, we have the same debate as yours. But in fact, we have to understand what the Germans understand in this crisis, that our national interest begin in the neighborhood within the internal market. And so we have to think about the future of and the prosperity of the internal market. That means that for sure we have to focus our efforts toward the European capital market and the banking union. This is maybe the reforming of our banking system that the US did some years ago.
Thank you. Yeah, so you touched upon so many issues that I don't know from where to start. But going back to the earlier crisis management, it's true that now we didn't do the same mistakes with the fiscal rules, for example, because they were clearly set apart and the countries were given the opportunity to boost the economies with the support of the central bank, because this is obviously one of the things that was very important for the crisis management. But as a result, monetary and fiscal policy are very intertwined at the moment. So that is one of the issues after this crisis that we are going to face. What we also, the problem that we still have in Europe is the problem of earlier debt, so old debt. So you mentioned Italy. So the high public debt, even if Italy is running primary balances since many years, it is still not enough because the stock of debt is so huge. So the main problem in Europe, in some European countries, is low growth. And I think this is what has changed with the next generation EU and compared to the previous crisis, is that it is not only about fiscal policy or about business cycle stabilization that we talk about, but we talk about structural reforms. Mm-hmm. And that is the sense, and at the core of economic growth. If we want economic growth in Europe, we need structural reforms in European countries. And after that, the debt is going to be less of a problem. That is how I see it. Another thing, this huge investment needs that we have goes hand in hand. It is not a debt as such that is a problem. It becomes a problem if it is not used wisely. If we use debt constantly, year after year, to support the existing system and transfers, for example, compared to investment, productive investment, then high public debt can become a problem. But obviously, using it to finance productive investment is completely a different story. And EU-wide public goods. Maybe we should start talking about what the EU should be doing, whether these digital investments and green investments should be something that should be seen as a public good at the EU level that should be taken not individually in each country, but at the level of the Union. So that is another important thing. And again, economic growth. You cannot have all. Rising public debt can be a symptom of low economic growth. And if we have some new needs, fostering growth is also a key to finance new investment needs as well. So in that respect, I would say that the next generation EU has started the right kind of discussion that we need in EU, talking about structural reforms in the countries.
Thank you, Päivi. And then I heard that Niklas would like to come in also, maybe from potentially German perspective.
Yeah, as you raised Germany and Germany's learning process, and I think, Mr. Giuliani, you're right when you point to the fact that Angela Merkel had this learning process after the Greek crisis, the Euro crisis, and coming into the financial turbulences that could arise out of the COVID-19 aftermath. It was very important for her to make this statement together with the French President Macron and to initiate this next generation EU process. So in that sense, I think, yes, there was some lessons learned in Germany, and they wanted to avoid another prolonged crisis management that we saw in the case of the Euro crisis. However, I wonder how lasting or how deep this change of mindset in Germany really is. There was a lot of talk that this next generation EU budget is Europe's Hamilton moment, so that this is kind of the first step into a bigger transition where you start to issue maybe Euro bonds more regularly, where you mutualize debt and you go into a deeper fiscal union, so to say, with common debt. I don't see that this would be a path that Germany would pursue further. There are some constitutional reasons for that, and the Constitutional Court in Germany is also very strictly, very hawkish on this issue. But I also see the political situation not ripe for this. Olaf Scholz, who might very well be the next chancellor, was once said in the German parliament, a German finance minister will remain a German finance minister, even if he comes from a different party and maybe has a different ideological background. And the next German finance minister might even come from the German Liberal Party if we see this traffic light coalition now in Germany going forward. And the Liberal Party is very much against deeper European reforms on the financial side. So I don't really see a sea change in German thinking. What I though see is when it comes to what you mentioned, public goods, investments that are ad hoc and are really based on something where there's an added value on European level, be it digitalization, be it climate change, mitigating infrastructure. There might be at the margins more willingness to put more investments on the table on the European level and make this ad hoc. Don't look at the old debt, but look at new bonds to give out, similar to the next generation EU framework. But that would be probably the way forward from a German perspective.
Thank you. I think this is very topical as well, given that this Franco-German push is often needed, and of course we follow very closely what might happen actually in that relation. And then when the parliament elections in France to have that perspective. But that would then mean that that the autumn 2022 could actually be a time when latest some of these issues might be on the EU table. But maybe in the field of economy, I think I still have two elements what could be interesting to discuss. Maybe the first one is what Päivi mentioned and what I've been highlighted in several, the European common goods. And maybe there is a kind of a possibility to redirect the discussion also about fiscal rules and the debt issue by concentrating on these common goods. These are often something that the Europeans, also European citizens, understand, and also the companies in Europe that they are needed given the increasing global competition. But then there is a question of how to finance these common goods. And we all know that that even if the EU's multi-annual budget was increased, it's still something which doesn't correspond anything akin to a federal budget or a substantial budget. What could kind of provide that kind of financial injection to the investments? So do you see that there is any possibility to open the discussion about the EU's own resources, meaning the funding question, that the EU would be in the future funded more through tax-like revenues rather than the member states paying to the EU budget? And do you have a sort of a view on that, whether that's the way to go, or whether this is something that is not something that you would like to see in the future? Who wants to start? Maybe Päivi.
I think the word tax-like revenues is the right one, because I think currently EU has revenues that are tax-like. They are not called taxes, but they are like that. And I think probably that is going to be the way forward, because I guess it is more acceptable if it's not called taxes. I think that is a good question, and not only the revenue side, but also the expenditure side should be discussed. So the multi-annual financial framework in general, it is always very difficult task for countries to agree on it. But I think still more priority should be given on that, and expenditure categories should be prioritized, just like in the government budget. So there should be like a very good review, a thorough review of the EU budget, and we should start discussing more like what would be those public goods and what do we want the EU to do, and then allocate resources to those tasks. Because it could be that we could find some revenues or by reallocating existing resources to these new expenditure categories, to these new needs, just like governments do in the budget, and not having to increase taxes or having to find some new ways to finance new expenditure.
Pascale.
Yes, it's a very important topic because, as you know, the MFF is very low, and it's not as high as we expect when we see all the State of the Union debate by Commission President to put on the agenda a lot of things. There is no money for that, and it is the fault of the member states, because for the moment the budget of the EU coming from the member states' pocket and contribution, and of course of the main member states. Not all the member states are contributors, so we have to change that. And the own resource is an old topic, but was put a new step like last year, because for the first time we said that we need to create a new own resource systems. So there is actually a new taxes. We are since the beginning about the plastic waste, so it is good because it is on the Green Deal and on the change of our civilization, etc. But it's not enough. And of course, the others, depending not only of EU member states, because there is things who are coming from the OECD, so it is more difficult, but it is maybe a discussion we have to have at the finance minister level and at the member states, just to say how we can put new own resources to made the contribution less and less important and make a real EU budget on the 2028 now, because it is the next one. And we have five years to define this new own resource. And it is very important to take that in account, because I think otherwise, if we don't do that, the citizens say, okay, we have a lot of expectation. You provide a Green Deal, climate change, digital transition, research, innovation. Of course, it is the 21st century right now. It is no more the Schuman Europe. It is not the end, no more Cold War. So we face a new world. And in this world, how we can manage at the EU level to push together something that could make the Union still a big actor in the future. And we will be strong together. Not France alone, not Germany alone, not French and German all together, but all together the 27. If one country will not be ready because of political reason, like Poland today or Hungary, of course, stay aside and we continue together and we will join after. But we need to make some steps forward in that direction in order to give perspective to the citizen, to offer them a future.
May I add just one word, a bit provocative, but it is my own feeling. What we face with the Green Deal and the climate change is so huge needs that no one of our country could finance that alone. And including with the budget system at the EU level from now. So my feeling is that we have Eurobond to finance next generation EU. We will have new Eurobond. And I know that in Finland it's quite a question, but I can give you my own feeling and my experience of the EU affairs. We will have new Eurobond to finance the fight against climate change. If not, we will not have a Green Deal.
Yeah, I think the investments related to the Green Deal are something which are very pertinent question. And I think also what Niklas suggested here, that this is maybe some avenue where the German government might be willing to think about more investments with the debt. But I think it's also a question which might be quite a far away, also in German thinking, from the idea of the Eurobond. And of course, this is something what might come to the discussions, and this is something that we've been following. And interesting to see how that develops. But of course, I think we have to remember that when we talk about the Green Deal, green transition, I think Europe is now taking maybe the first steps in that real revolution, what has been now promised and is needed to tackle the climate change. So in that sense, of course, many issues might come up to the table, and the joint financing of the Green Deal is a pertinent question. But of course, the views within the EU members are likely to be rather divided on that issue, at least in the short term. But I think it would be good now to move on our second topic here, the security and defense. And of course, we already heard from your interventions in the beginning that there is, of course, this more broader link also between the economy and security, and that relates to the Europe's position in the changing global power shifts. And this also relates to the field of economy, but security, defense. But we heard from many of you in the beginning, especially from Niklas and from Jean-Dominique, about the kind of the Finnish-French similarities in viewing the EU's defense. I think the background for these views might be different, but however, we see the kind of the convergence there. And to best of my knowledge, the Finnish defense minister met the French counterpart on Tuesday evening in Paris to discuss bilateral defense matters related also to the incoming presidency of the European Union. But one element what often comes into the discussions is this differentiation and potentially moving in the field of defense with those who are willing and able. And this relates to the smaller groups taking responsibility in the European defense and also within the EU framework. And this is, of course, a view that is in some parts of the Union, also to some extent in Germany, has been resisted and as a unitary actor, and these kind of divisions might be seen as harmful. But now I understood that there is quite vivid debate about allowing EU member states to take more responsibility in certain fields of defense needs. And it would be nice to hear your views on that, and whether there has been some change also in light of the events in Afghanistan, for instance, in last summer in the EU capitals, that this more differentiated approach to using military and crisis management tools could be a possibility in the future. Whether this is one of the French innovations related to the defense agenda of the presidency. Please.
Yes, it's maybe it's a field of a question of convergence between Finland and France. It's an old analysis, an old posture for France to try to be more independent. France is one of the best allies of the United States, but alliance is not submission. And for 10 or 20 years right now, what we saw on the global levels is the failure of the foreign policy, the US foreign policy. Iran, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and what next? It doesn't matter if it doesn't have an impact on our own interest. We, France, we faced in the past day a big issue with the submarine contract. It's not a question of a defense contract. We, France, are in the Pacific with the French Polynesia, with many territories, and all the Anglo-Saxon, which I understand they fear the China coercion policy, they forgot to speak with us. They don't care what we think. It's not acceptable. This is the reason why the reaction of the French government, the French president, was so tough. And I understand that it was a mistake of the US diplomacy, and we will repair that. Blinken was in Paris the last day, and so, but they did a mistake. And for Europe, it's very important because we are allies of the United States. We are in the same camp of liberty, liberal markets, liberal economy, and we are not a colony. We are the main commercial power in the world. if the US think that they could face the China challenges alone, they failed. They need Europe. And we need to have a strong relationship to keep our world free, to defend the human rights, the liberal economy and our system, and the innovation too, against the return of ideology that we don't share. And this is the reason why the French react so toughly. And I believe that for EU, it's a good opportunity to try to define common goods, but also common interest. Common interest. We have interest, and we have to recognize we have sometimes common interest, and we have to defend in common, or to promote them in common, and sometimes we have different interests, and we have also to be respectful of, for example, the German constitution. I spent many time in France to explain to my fellow citizens that they have to respect the German constitution and not to ask to the German to be French. They are German, they have a history, so it's difficult to understand for the French military, for example. So I spent many time to that. But so Europe is that, is diversity. We have a different posture, and for that, Finland and France share a lot of common interest, a kind of independence within an alliance and bilateral alliance also. You are in the Arctic zone with specific question and problematic, and you have neighbor, we have other neighbor in the south, and so we have to be respectful of that and to be complementary. This is what I believe the way to make some very concrete step in the defense issue, and to allow some of the country to act in the name of the other if the other don't want to act.
Yeah, there's a lot to comment on there, and a lot that I definitely agree on. For example, you mentioned the bilateral AUKUS treaty, and I must also say that there have been diplomatic mistakes and strategic mistakes being done in Washington in the way this was put forward, in the way this was communicated to European partners, and the way that what I found problematic was that a trade or like a commercial contract on procurement was combined with these more strategic questions, which are very important. How we gonna act towards security in Asia and in Indo-Pacific Sea. What I wanted to say. It might be logical, kind of, for the US maybe to have within the Five Eyes this cooperation between Australia and UK, and there's a certain logic to it. But the way it was then carried out, I think that was a little bit hard-handed, yeah, it's clear that there are concerns now on the European side. The question is now what follows out of this episode, and whether this should spill over into a deeper crisis in the transatlantic relations. And I think there were some concerns in other European countries that this might have now a collateral effect on, for example, cooperation in the technological area with the US, on cooperation within NATO. So while this was seen critical, I guess, in many countries, the question is how far should this be the defining issue in the transatlantic relation looking forward? And I think there's probably quite a consensus that there are many common interests on both sides of the Atlantic to keep on cooperation all the same. I thought when you said that U.S. foreign policy in the past, I don't want to quote you wrong, but you mentioned that that it has been mainly marked by failures. And one can, of course, point to many things that have gone wrong. But we have to also remember that many of these things have been done in cooperation with European allies, including... okay, of course, especially there, France was definitely having a different position, Germany at the time as well. But it's always easy to point to certain examples. And when we think about Afghanistan, yes, there were probably mistakes in the way the withdrawal was carried out, but I didn't see many European capitals protest when the US said that they want to end the war in Afghanistan. Okay, maybe the date was wrong, maybe the way it was rolled out was wrong, but it was general something where also there was not a big appetite anymore on the European side on this. So, but looking forward, I think when we talk about transatlantic burden sharing and the US is always very strong on saying, you know, that Europe should spend more on defense and should do more. I think we shouldn't only think about military burden sharing, but we also should think about more strategic burden sharing. And Europe, and here I think we probably can agree, Europe should be stronger in bringing its position into the transatlantic alliance, should be more clear of what it wants to achieve, what kind of instruments it wants to use for that. But of course, that is not an easy process. What I think on the European side is a very important development is the deepening of the European strategic culture. And that is always something that France rightfully promoted. That is also at the core of the European Intervention Initiative. And, you know, we have 27 member states with different historical backgrounds, different threat perceptions, different, you mentioned the constitutional constraints in some countries, and those won't go away. But to kind of work on a common understanding of what are the threats that we are dealing with, what are overlapping interests, overlapping areas where we can also act together, where we can use our capabilities. I think that is a very important exercise, and that's being done in the European Intervention Initiative, but also as part of the European Strategic Compass. And so that is a positive development.
Thank you, Niklas. Now I would like to ask whether the audience has some comments or questions to pose. I don't see any in the webcast, so I have to ask from my team that if there are some, they're not coming through. There are no. So
there's one in the audience.
Please.
Two, and there one in the back.
And one in the back as well.
Representative of the Revolutionary Foundation in Brussels.
Yes.
Eric Moraes.
Thank you. If I could add comments to the discussion on economic governance, the question I ask myself is, of course, with the pandemic, a lot of things have changed, especially with the recovery plans and the European funding for that, which will be a huge amount of money for certain countries. Which means that investment is very important, but also, and you mentioned it, the flexibility in how we implement the rules. And the debate on the Stability Pact is, if we come back to a strict implementation of the rules, the question I have is, isn't it a risk of having spent a lot of money asking to start structural reforms, and when this plan is over in a few years from now, this momentum would be cut by new implementation of the old rules of, you know, asking structural reforms without doing what it takes to have growth, which is the problem of Italy, for instance. So how do you? where do you see the balance between that? Because that will be, I think, the center of the
So the question is whether strict rules will be applied right after the reintroduction of the rules.
No, the question is whether the strict rules could be, well, whether the rules could be applied without going against the objectives of the recovery plans, and what is being done, especially with the Green Deal, the digital transition, which requires a lot of investment, which will be
well, the funds
then.
of the recovery fund are not taken into account in the rules in the first place. So there is expenditure that is perfectly matched from funds coming from the EU. So that doesn't affect financial positions of the countries at all. And then when you mention the structural reforms, well, whether they require any national money or not, that is another. It could be only changes in legislation. If you think about the structural reforms that have been requested from Italy or Spain, for example, they are related to pension systems or to legal systems. It doesn't necessarily imply or any use of money. Or I would guess, I have to say that if it requires money, it would come from the recovery fund. So I don't see any kind of clash between those two. But obviously, if you think about requiring some kind of fiscal adjustment right after the crisis or end of these recovery programs, it would be like repeating what happened after the Euro crisis. But I don't see that coming. The fiscal rules have never been applied very strictly. So there has always been some room for discretion from the Commission, for example, in applying the rules. So they have never been very strictly applied. And we see that. Why do we know that? We know that because public debt has been steadily rising over the years. So that obviously tells us that they haven't been very strictly applied. That is like a brief answer to that.
So we could argue that there is a need for realistic rules instead of strict ones that are
yes,
not
of course.
applied
So,
because the economic situation doesn't allow it.
So even if we reapplied the rules after the end of the recovery programs, I don't think they would be like strictly applied. So as strictly as to require some kind of a fiscal consolidation.
We need to talk to define new criteria for the rule.
Well,
Just to
of
adapt,
course, yes.
Just to adapt them to the reality and to the new challenges. And maybe we need rules, but new rules.
Yes, so I have actually been studying this, researching on this for a while, and we have a research paper coming next week on some kind of proposal on reforming these EU's fiscal rules. So a very complex issue and an important topic indeed.
And I think also the Stability and Growth Pact, although there are these targets,
Yes.
figures,
Yeah.
but there is also inserted that there needs to be movement towards the 60% target. So it's also how it's
Exactly.
interpreted. But of course, it might be a big question to open these treaties. But we will see. But now I think that there was at least one question from the audience, please. A second one. And then two.
Yeah.
Please.
Because to Mr. Helbig and the rest, I suppose as well, because Mr. Helbig, I suppose he kind of played the effects of the downfall of Afghanistan and I say the evacuation process, which was more kind of reactive than active, I suppose. So I would like to ask from each of you whether you think that the failure of the evacuation process in Afghanistan and the concurrent like AUKUS announcement, whether it truly did damage the transatlantic relationships, and whether there is still a significant deficit of trust between the US and its European allies, because at least in my personal opinion, it showed that despite its pretty speeches, realpolitik is alive and well in Washington.
So there was a question about the trust between the transatlantic partners, US and Europeans, in light of the Afghanistan situation and the withdrawal chaos. And this is a question for the panelists. But then there was a second question also from the audience. Madame Helena Petäistö, please.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to remind that during this pandemic, France and Finland had very different approaches in practice. France had this quoi qu'il en coûte, whatever it takes, for several areas in the economy, also in culture. And in Finland, Finland was much stricter. So how would you think that after these practically 2 years, having so different policies, there's a wide apart, how much more difficult is it to get once again together and to have these new fiscal rules?
Thank you very much. So for the webcast audience, there was a question about the differences, how the different European countries managed the COVID-19 crisis with the strictness of the restrictions, and France was, of course, in the upper end of that, and then here in Finland, partly because of the pandemic situation, we have had quite many liberties also during the pandemic. But the question was that how these different forms of adapting to the pandemic and fighting the pandemic might kind of, what it tells us about the EU politics and the cooperation in the negotiation tables, whether it has sort of increased differences or potentially provided new insights, understanding to the different European countries' traditions and so forth. But now our time is coming to an end, so I would pose these two broad questions for our panelists, the one on the transatlantic trust and the other one on the COVID restrictions, and then we have to conclude this session. So maybe we start with Pascale, and then we take Nick.
Alors, we will take the international and we will take the economy. Okay. For the transatlantic relation, transatlantic relation is still strong, but the United States say for a long time it's not Biden, it is not Trump, it was before, but the priority now is no more Europe, because the USSR is collapsed and the threat is not coming from Russia for many reasons. Russia is always a threat, but not the one it was when it was the USSR. And they look to the Asia. And it is a trend for a long time. So for the European, the question is, because of that point, the change of US point of view, we need to adapt and to change maybe our point of view too. And because for a long time, we think that US will be our friends forever. Of course, it's still a partner, but maybe we have to take in charge our own security, because one day they will say to us, no, it's not our problem, it's yours. No, do what you want, but we'll not be here anymore. So it's the reason why we need to think all together. Of course, it will not all the 27 member states, because they will neutral country people were not ready for, but the maximum of countries were for to think about the EU security agenda, because of the decision of the US to stay a part of, and it is good for them. And for Afghanistan, and just remind you that France was leaving 4 years ago because it was not more our interest to be in Afghanistan. But our ambassador still was the latest on the ground to make the refugee possible to flee.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think she already summarized it perfectly. I think we have to just face the reality that the interests of the US are changing and the focus of the US are changing, and that we should be prepared for this. So it's maybe not the category of trust. I think this is too strong, but if we have to do our homework here. So I completely agree with that. I wonder, though, how much the direct implications of the Afghanistan disaster, you can call it, will be. You know, there was this op-ed by Borrell that this is a wake-up call. Well, I cannot count how many op-eds there were since probably, you know, the war in Kosovo, that this is a wake-up call for European defense. That was Iraq, that was Ukraine, that was Libya, that was the refugee crisis. So countless op-eds that say that. So, I mean, not trying to be the pessimist here, but we will see if like another kind of top-down initiative, like a rapid intervention force or whatever it might be, will really be the element that is then taken up by member states and used and operationalized then in the end. Or if we rather need to think about more these processes that build up bottom-up trust, the strategic culture and like the fabric on which we can be more operational in the future. And that is maybe a little bit more of a long-term project than just having like one rapid intervention force more that is then just a paper tiger.
Thank you. And then the question about the internal EU politics post-COVID. If you have any views on that, please, Päivi and Erik.
Yes, well, countries are different. That is clear. They will remain different. And countries, EU countries, have conducted different kind of fiscal policy for years. And me and other economists, we can do research and come up with some kind of with a suggestion of perfect or desirable fiscal rules. But then the kind of fiscal rules that the EU will have will be a result of a political process, obviously. It's going to be a compromise between the countries.
Thank you. And then Erik.
Yeah, I think the pandemic was, or of course, all countries faced the same challenge, but differently because of the scale of the shock, of the health shock. Italy was hit first and more strongly than other countries, for instance. And the socio-economic fabric is also quite different from one country to another. And also the role of the state, the needs of the population were quite different also. So that's why it was obvious that national response would be different. Then what was at stake at EU level was to avoid big differences when we exit from the crisis. And that was the point of EU Next Generation, for instance, and which is a long-term work to try to, not to homogenize all the countries, but to try to avoid big gaps, destabilization, and in the end, destabilization of the single market, which was the point of the plan. So I think it will be this long term, which includes also the discussion on all these rules and investment with the double transition.
But on both issues, we need to think about EU governance.
And that will be the topic for our next exchange. That's a big topic, and of course there are various views to that question as well. But now our time is up, and I have to end this webinar, hybrid webinar being webcast. And it's been a pleasure to have our friends, guests here in Helsinki with us discussing a very big topics, economy and security, and also very broad but also detailed level. This is of course because we all know that these topics are now high on the EU's political agenda, and several of these might become very topical in national discussions as well, within a short-term view or a bit longer-term view. I think that this has really helped us to get sort of understandings and views which are sometimes different, but also helps us to understand the kind of the overall picture of the EU and the challenges that it faces. With these words, I would now like to thank Jean-Dominique, Erik, and Pascale, and also our own panelist Niklas, and then our visiting guest star from Etla Economic Research, Päivi Puonti. This has been a pleasure. Thank you for the audience as well. It was nice to have people in the room. It's been a long